Hello! Welcome to the last part of this series of videos where I kind of walk you through the process in how I take my Second Life photography. For this particular video, I'll be focusing on the Photoshop aspect of the process. First things first, here we are in Photoshop, and let's talk Photoshop versions because there's like a whole bunch out there. For me personally, I use Photoshop CC 2015. So some of the filters that I do use is actually only found in Photoshop CC. But you can use pretty much any Photoshop to edit. I'm just letting you guys know so that if some of the filters you see me use are not available on your Photoshop, it's probably because you have a completely different version. So some important things to cover before we start actually doing any type of editing is going to be shortcuts and hotkeys, as well as brushes in Photoshop. Shortcuts in Photoshop is super important when it comes to speeding up your workflow and having a bit more efficiency while working. Because I do use a lot of programs for my 3D work and all of them utilize a whole bunch of different hotkeys, I don't actually remember every single one of them. What I like to do is remember only the ones that I either need to use or use very often. The hotkeys that I like to use are going to be split into 3 different types of hotkeys and what their function are. So for the first one, it's going to be tools, which are basically Photoshop tools. The 2 particular tool that I like to use very often is going to be the brush and the eraser, because I do a lot of painting on my actual editing. So instead of navigating to the left-hand side and picking out those icons, I like to just hit the B key, and that's going to allow me to switch to the brush tool, and then I can start painting on my image. And then I like to press the E key to jump to my eraser tool, and I can start to erase all these different brush strokes. If you'd like to adjust your brush size for both brush and eraser, you can either right click on your document, which is going to bring up a little brush window, and you can click and drag this particular slider here to increase or decrease your size. Another way of doing that, if you just want to increase and decrease by small intervals, is to use the bracket keys on your keyboard. So if you hit the left bracket, it's just going to make your brush size smaller. If you hit the right bracket, it's just going to go bigger. And then now we can erase a whole lot more. The next hotkey that I like to use is the Alt key, which basically brings up this little dropper icon. And this is used to select colors on your screen. So what I like to do when I'm editing is to just select colors off of my image itself, and then I can start to use that particular color. This is just going to maintain a bit of consistency when you're editing your shots, rather than have multiple colors by kind of selecting it from here. The final hotkey that I like to use is the Free Transform tool. Occasionally I bring in images like this and I want to resize them. To kind of resize them quicker, what I do is press the Ctrl T, and it's just going to bring up my free transform, and I can start to transform this particular image any way that I want. If I hit the Shift key, it's going to allow me to resize it proportionally, so that's very important when it comes to keeping the proportions of your particular image. The next particular set of hotkeys is going to be related to the navigation of your document. So let's say I am editing this part of my document and I would like to kind of move over to another side. Rather than click on these different scroll bars here to navigate back and forth, what I can do is just hit the spacebar key, and it's going to turn my icon into a little hand, and I can click and drag it any way that I want. The next particular one is going to be for rotation. So let's say we are drawing little hair strands here. It can be really difficult when the orientation of your image doesn't quite fit your hand position. So what you can actually do is to just hit the R key, and it's going to bring up this rotate canvas icon. So you just have to click on your canvas itself, and it's going to allow you to rotate it any way that you want. If you hit the Shift key while doing this, it's going to snap it into certain axes, and that's how you kind of get it back in place when you need it to. So let's say I rotate it this way. Now I can start to hit the B key and draw in those hair strands without having to distort my body position just to do that. The final set of hotkeys that I'll be using are basically document related hotkeys. The first one is going to be saving, which is very important, and you should be doing this, maybe every 10 minutes or so that you don't lose your work. One way for you to save is to either go up to File, Save or Save As, or you can just use the hotkey, which is Control S, and it's going to bring up a little window that you can kind of rename your file. If you kind of use the format of Photoshop, which is a PSD, what will happen is that every time you hit the Control S, so let's say I made some changes here, and then I hit Control S, what it does is that it saves over that particular PSD. So if you want to kind of create a new document again and not save over the previous one, what you have to do is press Control Alt and S, and it's going to allow you to bring up the Save As option, and then now you can kind of save it as any file you want. If you make a mistake in Photoshop, actually this particular hotkey is going to be something that most of you know, but let's say you made a couple of strokes and you'd like to undo this. What you can do is press Control Z, and it's going to step backwards. But if you press Control Z again, it actually, undoes back and forth. So what you want to do is Control Z, and then to go backwards again is Control Alt and Z. So you can keep Control Alting and Zing for as long as you want, at least for however many undo histories that you have in Photoshop. The next thing is going to be when we want to copy and paste items. So for example, I have another document open here, and I want to copy this particular document over to the other one. What I can do is hit Control A, which will select the whole thing, and then Control C to copy, and then go back to the other file, and then Control V, which is pasting this. At the end of the day, when it comes to hotkeys and shortcuts, a lot of it is going to be muscle memory the more you use it. So don't worry too much about remembering all these hotkeys. The more you kind of use certain tool, the more you immediately kind of navigate to those particular hotkeys on your keyboard. The next thing we're going to be touching on is Photoshop brushes. I've had so many people ask me about what brushes I use, and it's really odd to me because most of the time I honestly just use the soft round standard brush. But I do have a couple that I've downloaded, and most of these are pretty recent except for the hair brushes. And I'm going to show you guys 15 brushes that I've set as my main editing brushes and why I'm planning to use them as such. I also wanted to share this neat little plugin that can be super useful for you guys who have a massive brush collection. So this particular one that I've docked over here is called the Brush Gordon plugin, and it's available for trial, or you can purchase it for $10, but it's honestly one of those life-saving Photoshop plugins. If you right-click and look at the default brush window, it's really bad in terms of organizing your brushes. You honestly don't know what each of them are unless you start using them. So with this particular plugin, what you can do is set different folders and then categorize each of your brushes into those different folders. You can even kind of arrange them any way you want, which you are not able to do with the default Photoshop brush window. So these are some of my main brushes that I actually use. For the first two brushes, it's actually available if you were to right-click on your brush window, click on this little gear here, and then navigate down to round brushes with size. And it's just going to allow you to put all these brushes from number 1 to 300 right here. And the two brushes that I use is this particular one here called the Airbrush Round Soft 17, and this particular one called the Pen Opacity Flow. So what this brush does is, if you draw, it's just a little softer brush, and then the more you kind of go over it, the more solid it starts to look. This particular one is kind of the same thing, but it's just really harsh. So I usually use this to paint every single item in my scene, and it's really my standard brush of choice. And then this particular one, I use it just to, I don't know, sometimes I want to write stuff on my window, and using the soft one can be really odd. So I like to use this one and then kind of just like write whatever I want. Hello. The next brush is going to be from RAL. It's called a textured round, and essentially what this is just a round brush with a little bit of texture on it. What I like to do with this particular brush is kind of go down to about 3 or 7 and then use it to draw in hair strands. I don't know if you guys can tell, but if you use this to draw a hair strand, there's a bit of texture to it that makes it look more realistic. Another hair strand brush that I like to use is this particular one, which is a heart elliptical from Raisin, I believe. Yeah. So this particular one is the same thing. I like to turn it down to 3 as well. And then when I use it, it has a little bit of a slight curve that gives a very nice stroke. So the next brush here is actually a combination of the two. I like the texture of this one, but I like the shape of this one a lot. So what I did was I took the RAL brush and then I hit this brush editor window, and then I kind of modified this particular shape here under brush tip shape to match that brush that was available from Raisin, and this was how I created this particular brush. So the brush that I end up using the most is actually this particular one instead of these two, but I kind of keep them just in case one day I wanted a round one, or one day I just wanted something a bit smoother. The next couple of brushes is going to be hair brushes. This particular one is from Paravine as well as this one. What I like to do with this is to kind of make it a smaller value, and it's going to allow me to draw in brush strokes like these. This one is kind of the same thing, but if you were to draw it out, you'll notice that it has a little bit of a softer look to it, as well as some really transparent strands on the end. So if you wanted something softer, this would be the brush that you use. And these two are from Raisin. It's a little bit the same thing. It's just harsher and very, very fine, and there's a lot more strands to it, whereas these, I think there were only 3 strands. This one is the same brush, but it's slightly more intense in terms of the strand count. Sometimes if I want to block in a huge amount of strands, I just use this. It just makes life easier for me. The next couple of brushes are all going to be skin texture brushes, and this is what I like to use when it comes to drawing any type of skin texture or adding shadow onto my image. Instead of using that standard round, sometimes I would use this to kind of add a bit of texture. I'm going to zoom in so that you guys can see this a little bit better. There's a little bit of a texture fading on the edges, whereas if you use the number 17 brush, it's kind of not quite as apparent. So that's what that brush does. I believe this one is from Keep Waiting over at DeviantArt. The next brush is kind of the same thing, it's just softer and a lot wider in its fall off. And this final one is also from Keep Waiting, but it's from a different set. It has a slightly different texture, but it's so similar that honestly, I don't even know why I have both of them there, but I do. But it does have a wider fall off as well. And then this one is going to be from Keep Waiting as well, and it's just a rougher skin texture. So when my avatar looks a bit too smooth, I like to use this particular brush to kind of add texture to the skin. The next one does the same thing, but a lot lighter than this. And finally, I have one which is to add pores onto the skin. It's also from Keep Waiting. And this is kind of the same thing. It's just for this particular one, it's better for blushes and eyeshadows. And then this one is just to purely add skin texture onto your avatar. So those are the predominant 15 brushes that I like to go back and forth a lot with. What I like to do when I'm actually working is not have this whole window open like that. I like to go up to the setting option and then change it to paint mode. And what this does is kind of dock it into a very thin window here, and I can just click and use whatever brush that I want to very easily. So now we're ready to start editing our image. So here we have a whole bunch of options in terms of snapshot that we've taken out from Secondlife. And if you wanted to open each and every one of them, it does take a little bit of time. So what I like to do, I'm going to click and drag this out of the way. I like to go over to Photoshop and then go up to File, Scripts, and then click on this particular one called Load Files into Stack. I'm going to click that and then hit Browse and just navigate to that particular folder where I saved everything out. And I'm just going to click and drag it all the way down, click Open, click OK, and just wait for everything to load up. Now that everything has loaded up, what happens here is if I navigate up to the Layers window, you're going to find that it's kind of opened up all the files, and then you can kind of just click and drag all the way down to hide everything and go through each and every one if you want to. So this is how I load all my files very quickly, straight away, just so that I can edit it. So in this first part of my editing process, for me, this is my starting point, and what I'm trying to do is establish a base image for me to edit off of. So this particular process is going to involve a lot of what I call stacking of win lights, but it's essentially just using the layer options in Photoshop and then tweaking the blend modes in order to create like a final base image to work from. So what blend modes are in Photoshop is when you navigate to the layers window and then you have a whole bunch of these opened up, whenever you click one of these layers, you can actually go up here to change what type of blend mode this particular layer has. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these blend modes in this tutorial. It's just going to take way too long, but I will show you some of the ones that I actually use. This entire process that I'm showing you guys is essentially something I learned out of doing 3D renders. I realized that when we were trying to create a final image for presentation, what we normally have to do is do a composite of our render scenes. So I like to take that idea, bring it into Secondlife, and then implement it using the win lights in Secondlife. So this particular process is kind of like a compositing. I just call it stacking of win lights because it's a more direct approach of exactly what I'm doing. So let's talk a little bit about blend modes. I'm just going to start off with this particular image just because it's the most default shot that I want to use, and I'll hide the ones at the top. First things first, every single layer file that you put on here is going to be akin to pieces of paper. So if you took a piece of paper with this particular image and then you placed another one on top of it, you're not going to be able to see the image at the bottom unless this particular paper was transparent. So this is where you can kind of play with the opacity here. And if you made this a little bit more transparent, then basically you'll see the base image, but also the other one on top of it. And this particular look is essentially a combination of what this particular opacity is, as well as what blend mode it is. So with normal, none of the color information is changing that much, and all you're doing is adjusting how transparent a particular layer is going to be. The next blend mode that we'll be talking about is going to be screen, because that is the blend mode that I use the most often. So for example, you have a picture like this, where everything is pretty much black and then you have like a really bright light around it. What I like to do is turn this into a screen layer. And what screen essentially does is that it actually has a very mathematical explanation, but I'm not going to do that because, that's just not how I remember things. What screen does is that it essentially lightens the layers underneath with the colors of whatever layer that you're kind of operating from. So with screen, anything that is black is going to become totally invisible because there's no light information to lighten the other image with. And then anything white is going to be purely opaque. So when I talk about black and white, every single image that you have, whether it's a colored image or a black and white image, there's actually a value involved to that particular color. So if I were to go up to image, adjustments, and then I desaturate this entire thing, you're going to notice that this particular green is actually a white value or a gray value. And that value is basically what's allowing the computer to kind of calculate how that light is going to look. So if I change this to screen, you can essentially add light information, but not have all those blacks showing up. So the next blend mode is going to be color dot, which is right below screen. I use this very often too, and if I change this same layer to color dot, you can kind of tell how it looks like. It's the same effector screen in a sense that it lightens the image, but the calculation actually adjusts the contrast as well. And what I like to use this for is actually not for shots like these. I like to use screen for shots like these, and then for shots like these, I would use color dodge. Because what I want to do is really get the light information, because when it comes to lights itself, you want it to be very, very contrasted to kind of evoke the feeling of light emitting from that particular object. So if I change this to color dodge, you can immediately tell like how, bright these lights are gonna get. If you guys are familiar with the dots tool in Photoshop, this particular blend mode is actually like that, but in layer form. The next blend mode I want to talk about is going to be multiply, which is basically the opposite of screen, where in a sense what you're doing is darkening the image. So what is going to be transparent is going to be anything white, and then what is going to be opaque is anything black. If you change this particular shot where I kind of want all the shadow information, if I change this to multiply, you're going to see that everything kind of washes out. You don't see a single thing. And the reason for that is because, like I said, if I were to desaturate this, you notice that everything is kind of gray. Nothing is really white in nature. So what I'm going to do is undo that and then change it to multiply. But then I'm going to go to image, adjustments, and then levels, and I'm going to start to brighten that shot. So I usually push this up a little bit and then kind of adjust all these little slider tools and click OK. So what I've done is change that original image to this particular one, which is really, really bright. And then when I changed it to multiply, you can see that it gets that shadow information that you might not necessarily have gotten from your original shot. So the next type of blend mode I want to talk about is going to be overlay. So overlay is going to fall into this particular section called the contrasting blend modes, and essentially it's creating contrast by both lightening and darkening the image at the same time. It's a little complicated to explain because of, how it's calculated in the back end. What I like to think of it is, it's like a combination of multiply and screen. So anything that is higher than 50% gray, they're going to kind of use a screen option. And then anything that is darker than 50% gray, they're going to utilize a multiply option. So it's doing both things at the same time, darkening and lightening the image. So what's going to appear transparent and what's not? Anything that is 50% gray in value is going to be transparent. Anything that is lighter is going to be opaque. Anything that is darker is going to be opaque as well. But at the same time, it does a little bit of adjustment to the contrast as well based on the base image. But anyway, so what I like to do with overlay is kind of use shots like these to really add a little bit of contrast to the image. Another thing that I really like to do with overlay is using shots like these. So this one is predominantly 50% gray, and then all these are lighter and all these are going to be darker. If I did an overlay with this, what you'll see is that, I don't know if you guys can actually see it, but what you see is that the grays aren't actually showing, and it's only showing all those darker areas as well as brighter ones. So if I turn off this one, maybe you'll see it better. Yeah. So there you go. All the bright lights are going to be contrasted higher and lighter, and then all the dark ones are going to be contrasted lower and darker. So I hope I didn't botch the explanation of all these different blend modes, but essentially those are the 4 different blend modes that I like to use, including normal, which is basically just normal stuff. And then I would kind of tweak the opacity values here. And if I need anything to be adjusted, I would always go to image adjustments and adjust the levels or brightness and contrast or hue and saturation. So I'm not going to explain in detail what these 3 things are. And I didn't really explain in detail what the blend modes are. I feel like all of that is a lot better done in a separate tutorial. But I just wanted to explain to you guys a little bit of this particular process that I undergo to create a base image. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just speed up the process and then start from scratch as if I didn't edit any part of this image, and then start to do all these blend mode adjustments until I get a final base image that I'll be editing from. So what you see on the screen is going to be the base image that we're going to be starting our edit from. I've merged everything down just for the sake of this tutorial, so everything is neat and tidy, but sometimes I do keep all my layers open. So if you looked at that entire speed through process and kind of thought that was really random, because I was doing so much flipping around of what colors worked, how I wanted things to look like, the arrangement of the layers. Honestly, this particular stage is very, very random and experimentational for me. What I like to do is just trial and error a whole bunch and see what visually appeals to me at that particular point in time when I'm editing that shot. But I hope that the explanation for blend modes as well as looking at the speed through process does give you a little bit of insight as to what goes through my head when I'm doing this entire process. I found out that the longer I go in Secondlife as a photo editor, the more I like to practice a little bit of restraint when it comes to editing my shot. Right now, what I like to do is keep things very Secondlife looking, but enhanced a little bit. And then a lot of the editing process after this is going to be polishing the shot that you see on the screen versus editing it so much that it doesn't look like it comes out from Secondlife. So that's really what I meant by practicing restraint when it comes to editing. This particular part of the editing process is going to be where I start to create my depth map channels. I personally use it to kind of create a depth of field effect in Secondlife. If you're like me and you don't have a very strong computer that can run depth of field and then control it at the same time, you're going to struggle a lot with creating a very good depth of field for your photographs. This particular method kind of is a solution for that. The depth of field effect is actually going to occur pretty much at the end of the editing process, but I like to get the depth map channel out of the way really early on. These are some of the win lights that I got out of Secondlife. This particular one is going to be the one that I included in my Dropbox for you guys to download. And then the one underneath is going to be the Auric Grey Wind Light. So you can tell the difference between the two. Both of them are kind of the same thing, which is very gray toned images. You kind of have everything that is nearer to the foreground in a darker tone, and then the one that's further away in a lighter tone. But most of the time I actually use my own depth map because I do like the contrast that you can get. So the reason why you want the value shifts to be a little bit more contrasted is because you kind of want to allow the program to be able to calculate what is the furthest distance from your scene. So anything that is very light is going to be very far away, and then anything that is very dark is going to be nearer to the foreground. For this particular image, I'll only be using my own particular depth map, so I'm just going to delete the auric gray, and I'm going to create two different versions of this depth map to use for two different things. So I'm going to duplicate this and then just work on the layer underneath first. So for this particular one, I'm going to use it for my depth of field effect. So I want to adjust the contrast a little bit more just to make sure the program calculates everything a little bit more appropriately. So I'll go up to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and I'm going to push this particular slider to the right-hand side, and I'll push this one to the left-hand side. What it does is that it's just adjusting the whites and the blacks. So what I really want to do is make sure that the blacks are very, very black and then the whites are a little bit lighter. And you can tell that the birds are a lot more contrasted this way, and this is what I'm going to be using. You can even click on the middle one to kind of adjust this as well. So I'm going to click OK. And this is what I'll be using for my depth of field effect. For this particular one, I want to use it for my masking. So what I want to do is just make sure everything in the foreground is extremely separated from the background. I'll do the same process of going to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. And this time I'm going to push the sliders even more dramatically. And then I'll push the middle one a little bit closer to this end. And then kind of tweak it a little bit more. So I want the birds predominantly to be pretty white, basically. And I'm going to click OK. So you can tell some of the areas here have been affected because of the glow from the light source. So you can either kind of correct it, or for me, I just ignore it and then I kind of fix it later on when I'm editing. So what you want to do now is put this into the channels layer of your image that you're working on. So what I'm going to do is Control A, copy this, and then go back to my other image. Instead of pasting it in the layers window, I'm going to navigate to my channels window, which has RGB, red, green, and blue. You guys can ignore all of that. We're going to create two new layers by clicking on this icon here. So I'm going to click on it twice. So for Alpha 1, I'm going to paste that shot that I copied, and then I'm going to go back to this. Make sure you're not on channels, go back to layer, click on the layer underneath it, copy this, go back to this one, go to channels, and then paste it on Alpha 2. So those are going to be your two alpha channels essentially. So what I like to use Alpha 1 for, where the background and foreground is very contrasted with one another, is to kind of select out the foreground away from the background. How you do that is to press the Control key and then hit the thumbnail here. And you can see that the marquee has changed a little bit. So if you go back to the Layers tab and then you create a new layer, you can now kind of use the paint bucket and just fill it up. And you can see basically what I mean. Now none of the foreground is being affected by that particular mask, and everything else in the background is affected. You can fix all these little artifacts by pressing E on the eraser. I'm going to increase this a little bit and then just kind of erase it out. So why this is beneficial is sometimes you want to put certain layers in that will only affect the background. And having this as a masking tool is going to be very useful. So since I've kind of erased and cleaned up the edges of this one, I can just use this particular layer as my new selection tool by clicking on Control, click on that. And then what I'm going to do is create a group. So I'm going to just create a new group. And then I will use this particular button here to create a mask. And hide that one. So now every single layer that is within that group, every time I use that particular group and paint on it, it's never going to affect my avatar. So this can be a really good way for me to kind of add effects like a gradient. So I can add a gradient like so, and then set it to multiply, lower the opacity a little bit. And you can see that it kind of adds a little bit of depth to the background without affecting the foreground images. So that's how you can use the depth map Winlight to create a masking tool. And we're going to use this again later on when we start to create our depth of field effect. The next stage of this tutorial is going to be me going through the Liquify tool, but before we do that, I really wanted to adjust the color of this gradient because I just didn't really like how it looks. Now that we've done that, we can start to touch on Liquify. So what I like to do before liquifying anything is just to duplicate this particular layer so I have a copy underneath and I can see the changes a little bit easier this way. To get to the Liquify filter, what you want to do is go up to Filter and then click Liquify. And it's just going to bring up this particular window. Liquify Filter is a really powerful tool that every Photoshop user should learn to use. This particular filter is going to allow you to kind of move the pixels around your image and modify certain edges that might not be very smooth. So I like to just use the two tools up here. This one will allow me to kind of click and just warp things around. And then this particular one is just the undo of that. But the really cool thing about Photoshop CC is actually face-aware Liquify. If you're not using Photoshop CC, this might not appear for you, but if you are, you're going to be able to kind of adjust the facial expressions of your avatar, which can be really cool for portrait shots. So you can make the eye size bigger, make her smile if you want it, and do all kinds of crazy things to this shot. Obviously, you don't want to go overboard with this, but you can really make modifications. So I'm just going to undo all of that, and then what I will do now is actually speed up the video while I liquify this particular image so you guys don't have to watch me do it in real time. So once we've done with the Liquify tool, if you flip back and forth from the original image to the current one that you liquefied, you can tell that there's quite a bit of difference. And these differences have to reflect on our channel's images as well. Because if not, a lot of what we're going to use the channel's images for is not going to work quite as well. So I'm going to navigate down to the channels window and then go to Alpha 1. And instead of going through the Liquify process all over again, I can actually just hit Filter and then click Liquify, which was the last filter that we did. And it's going to reflect the changes on this layer. Go down to Alpha 2, Filter, Liquify. And it's going to reflect the changes on this as well. This next part of the editing stage is where I begin to paint and polish up the image. I don't particularly have much to show and explain for this particular part, aside from patience and practice, because this particular area of editing only gets better over time as you build up your skills and experience doing so. So what we'll be doing is we're going to be zooming into the shots and then looking at all the broken areas that need to be polished. So for example, this hairline is a little bit off. And then we have artifacts around the face. This area is kind of cut off. And then some of these shadows are not quite smooth. And this one is missing like a big chunk. So what we'll be doing is just going to be creating a new layer using the brush tool. So my hotkey is going to be B and E. My left hand is constantly on my keyboard as my right hand is working to switch back and forth constantly. And then what we'll be doing is just kind of picking out the colors of the scene and then painting things in. So essentially that's all we'll be doing. Some of the tips I have for this particular part of the process is going to be number 1, work with layers. So create a new layer whenever you're moving to a different area of your work. What I like to do when I work with layers is have them so that I can easily adjust it. So for example, if I don't really want to see this layer, I can hide it and then see if that particular edit works fine, or if I want to create a new layer to fix that up. The next tip that I have is going to be adjust your brush opacities. And you can do that by clicking on the opacity bar here and then adjusting this particular slider. What I like to do is work with a very low opacity, especially in some areas around the face. So this particular spot, for example, if you have a very high opacity like this and you kind of brush it in, it's just a little too harsh. So I like to work with a low one and then slowly kind of build things up a little bit. Finally, the last tip is going to be move around constantly. What I'm talking about moving around is once you worked on this area, zoom out. You can put it to fit screen right there. See how it looks as an overall, and then move on to another part of your image. Never stick with one area for too long, because what's going to happen with that is you find yourself overworking one area and then the rest of it is kind of ignored. So I'm going to speed up the video from here on out so that you guys don't have to watch me do this in real time. At the end of the day, like I said, it's just patience and practice. At this particular point, I'm pretty satisfied with where the image is kind of headed towards. So I've grouped up everything that I've done so far so I can flip back and forth and see how things are looking. This next part is going to be still a painting process, but what's going to happen is we're going to start mixing blend modes as well. I'll start to add certain shadows that aren't appearing very well, and then I'll start to add lights to kind of brighten up certain objects around the scene. And how I do that is I'm going to use the multiply blend mode to add shadows and then the overlay to add light. The reason why I don't use dodge and burn for this particular process is because I find that using layers and blend modes will allow you to control your shadows and lights a lot more accurately. One of the areas that I always work on is going to be the underside of the face. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer and then zoom into the avatar. Take the pen tool, and the pen tool is going to be what we use to make certain selections. So the way the pen tool works is that you click on any point, and then the next point that you click on, make sure that you click and then drag so that you can kind of conform this little shape. And then what you're trying to do here is to get it to fit the avatar's face. So when I talk and do this, I get very distracted, so I'm just going to undo. Once I'm done making that pen tool selection, I will right click and then click Make Selection, and it's going to turn this into a little marquee selection. So what we can do now is I can hide this by pressing Ctrl H so that I don't get distracted by all the little dots. And then I'm going to switch this to multiply, use the brush tool with the soft brush, make it a little bit bigger and pick out a darker color, and you can start to kind of paint in a shadow. Then I'll zoom out and I kind of erase this a little bit so that it's not so harsh. Then you can always lower the opacity to make it a little less dramatic as well. But the idea is just to kind of add a little bit more shading at the underside of the face. And then the next thing that you want to do is add light to this area that usually catches a little bit more light. So I'm going to create a new layer, switch this to overlay, and then we're going to inverse our selection. So if I Ctrl H to show the selection, what I'm going to do is go to select and inverse, and it's just going to inverse to the other side. I'll Ctrl H to hide it again. And this time around, I'm going to make sure that my brush is set to the 17 pixel one. Zoom back in and then flip to a white color. Use the pen tool to kind of do the same thing, which is to draw an area around the chin. And once we do that, we're going to right click, stroke path, and make sure that simulate pressure is on, and just click OK. And you can add a little light here. Then occasionally I don't really like the shape of it, so I'll use the smudge tool and then I'll kind of push certain things around a little bit. So if you group these two images up, the combination of adding shadow and light kind of adds a bit more depth to the image, and it just makes this facial area a little bit more pronounced than usual. So this is exactly what I'll be doing for the next part. Everywhere where I want to kind of add light, I'll be using this overlay layer to kind of paint in the whites. And then anytime I want to add a bit of shadowing, I'll be using multiply. And I'll be doing the combination of these two, as well as polishing up some of those other areas that I've missed. At this point of the edit, I've kind of merged everything down into one layer just so I can save myself a bit of memory space. At this point, before we start to go about finessing our image, what I like to do is really start to add a depth of field effect. So what I'm going to do is right click on this and then duplicate the layer so that we have a history of how this image looks like without depth of field. And we're going to start to navigate to those channels that we've created earlier on. So instead of this particular one that we used, we're going to be using the Alpha 2 channel. Navigate back to your layers section and then click on the layer that you want to affect. Go up to Filter, Blur, and then go on to Lens Blur. This is going to load up a lens blur window. In order to work a little bit quicker, what you want to do is click on faster versus more accurate. And this just is a lot less texting on your computer. So the source up here is where we start to define where the computer is going to read the depth of field information from. So you want to make sure that you click on it and set it to Alpha 2. Right underneath that, we have the blur focal distance, and this is going to determine how the computer is reading which areas you want to blur. So when this is really low like so, what it's doing is that everything that was black is going to be very sharp, and then everything around that is going to be a lot blur. To see this a little bit better, what I'm going to do is increase the noise. And you guys can kind of tell any part where it's noisy is basically where things are blurred out. When we move this to the other end of the spectrum, what you see on the image is that everything in the foreground starts to be the item that's blurred out. If you move it to the middle section, what happens is that it's going to try and pick out a gray in the middle. For this particular image is this bird here that's very sharp, and then everything else is blur. So for my particular image and depth map, what I'm trying to do is kind of get the foreground very much sharp. So I'm going to keep that at 10, and then I'm going to lower this noise amount back down to about 3, just so I get a little bit of grain in the background, but not so much. And then how much blurring is going to happen on your image is going to be dependent on this area here, which is the radius, blade curvature, rotation, as well as the shape of the blurring effect. So the higher you place your radius, the more blurry this image is going to get, and it's going to be up to you what works best for you. These are the settings I've decided to go with. So what I'm going to do now before I click OK is to turn it back to more accurate and then hit the OK button. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. So when we flip back to the original image, you can tell how sharp it was, and then with the blurring effect, everything is sort of washed out. And I think that that adds a very nice depth to the shot. So with this particular method, you're going to have a lot more control over your depth of field and how blurry you want everything to get without really taxing your computer by allowing it to use the depth of field within Secondlife viewers. Now that we're done adding a depth of field into our shot, we're going to focus on primarily finessing this image and really trying to complete the painting process. What we're trying to focus on at this point is trying to make the image look a lot less static than it is, because at the end of the day, this is a shot from a virtual world, and every time you take anything from a virtual world, there's always a little bit of staticness to it. So what we're trying to do is add little details that really breathe life into the shot. These particular details are not going to be details that you can see from a very far view, but when you zoom in into the shot or when you're looking at it on flicker and somewhere up close, basically, all those little details are going to be what really makes a difference in the image. So one such detail is going to be flyaway hairs. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer and then zoom in a little bit closer. So in this particular shot, we've added a bit of rim lighting into the edges. And usually when you look at photography in real life, every time there's a bit of rim lighting around someone's head or someone's face, what you'll see is a lot of flyaway strands around the edges. So what I like to do at this point is to pick out one of these brushes that allow me to add hair into the scene, and then start painting in the hair by grabbing one of these colors and just drawing that in. You don't really have to be very neat with this, because a lot of the times flyaway hairs tend to be a little bit on the messy side. So I'm going to continuously add a lot more of that as we go, but the next part that I want to show you guys is how to kind of make this sweater look a little bit more natural. Every time you have an object from Second Life that's a bit furry, what creators tend to do with making items a bit furrier in Second Life is stack up two mesh objects one on top of the other and then make the top object a little bit more transparent. What that does is kind of pull out the texture a little bit and gives you an illusion of fur and softness. But what happens in a shot is that you get this little rim around your object, which is the alpha kind of showing up. And you can totally leave it like that, it's not a big issue. Because if you look at it from a far distance, honestly, you're not going to be able to tell. But what I like to do to add a little bit of realistic detail is to use the smudge tool. And then we're going to pick one of these hair brushes. Make sure that sample all layers is turned on, and then the strength is set to 100. The brush that I'm using is a little bit big, so I'm going to right click and make it smaller. And what I'm going to do is also create a new layer, just so that, the hair is going to be on one layer and the fur effect is going to be on the next one. And then we're just going to click and drag it out like so. And what it does is that it just blurs out this little edge here. Make it smaller a little bit. And you want to be doing this a little bit randomly because at the end of the day, fur isn't exactly the most structured thing. When we zoom out on this, you can kind of tell that this area is going to look a bit more furry than the other areas we have not touched on. And that little detail is just going to add a bit more realism to your shot. At the end of the day, the sweater is trying to be furry, so what you're doing here is just enhance it a little more as a photo editor. So at this point, I'm going to make the video go at a faster speed so that you guys can see me finesse this shot to the final stages of the painting process. we've done finessing the piece, what we want to do next is to try and add a little bit more realism to the surrounding environment using stock images online. You can find stock images from Shutterstock, Creative Market, Etsy, DeviantArt. There's so many websites that offer stock images for you to download. Because I've been accumulating these stock images for the past couple of years, I really honestly don't have information as to where they come from, but those few websites were predominantly where I got these stock images from. What you want to look for in those stock images are what we call photo overlays. Photo overlays are going to be photographs that are predominantly darker in nature, and then you're going to have a few elements which are brighter, and you don't necessarily use the overlay blend mode for these. These are actually layered over all your other layers. That's why they are called photo overlays. But the ones that I like to use tend to be dust particles like these, which will add a bit of movement around the air of your shot. And then we have flare effects like these, which kind of add a fake sunlight of sorts. And because my particular shot has some lights at the background, I want to use images like these to kind of supplement those Second Life lights. And then we have smoke effects like these, which will kind of add depth into the background area of the shot. The way that I work is I usually have those photo overlays docked into another screen and monitor. So what I can do is just select the ones that I want to use and then click and drag it over to this monitor that I'm working on. And a bounding box is going to appear automatically. You want to hit the Shift key so that you can proportionally edit this and just make it really, really large. And then we're going to change this blend mode to screen and just click the check mark here to be okay with the transformation. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can adjust this a little bit better. So you can see that there's a light effect coming in that you don't necessarily get from Second Life lights, and this is what we want to use. So obviously we have to modify this light a bit so that it's not so intense. What we can do is go up to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and we can start to control the level of this image. My purpose of using this light is just to add a bit of warmth to the left-hand side of the image, so I don't really want it to be really, really intense. What I'm going to do is lower the opacity to about 30 to 50, actually, yeah, so about 50%. And then the next thing we want to do is add a little bit of fog effect to the background. I'm going to pull a fog effect into the shot, and I'm going to want to use the bottom area more so than the top. So I'm going to flip it vertically. And then I'm going to change this to a screen layer. And what you see happening is that it's kind of affecting the foreground as well, which is not what I want. So I'm going to use that layer mask that I've done in the start of this video. I'm going to use Alpha 2. I'll go back down here and I'll make a group for it. And then just create a layer mask for it. And pull that layer in. So what's going to happen is now you can kind of move that image around, but the layer mask is going to be affecting the whole group, which is basically any layer within that group. So I want this positioned somewhere here, and I'm going to right click and rasterize it so that I can kind of get rid of this line here by erasing it. I want the fog effect to kind of appear a little bit better, so I'm going to adjust the levels once again. And so this is what I got out of that fog effect, and you can change the color of this as well by going to Image, Hue and Saturation. And then instead of just adjusting the saturation here, what you want to do is hit Colorize so that it colorizes that smoke. And then you can start to tweak from there. So I'm going to continue to pull in those images from my photo overlays folders, and then we're going to stack up a couple of photo overlays to really try and bring this image to life. we're done adding all these effects, what I really like about having all these photo overlays is that it really adds a bit of movement and dynamicness into your shot. From here on out, we're going to be moving to the final and last stage of this photo editing. In this process, what I like to use is Camera Raw Filter. Camera Raw Filter, I believe, is only available on Photoshop CC. So if you're not on Photoshop CC, you might not have this available to you. But every single feature available in this particular filter is actually found in different parts of Photoshop. What they did is just kind of condensed it into one window so that you can adjust the whole thing without having to move around so much. So I'm going to go back to my layers window, and then I'm just going to merge the whole thing down together to save some memory space. And then I'll duplicate this one time. And then we're going to go to Camera Raw Filter, which is in Filter, and then Camera Raw Filter. So this is going to open up a Camera Raw Filter window, and there's going to be a whole bunch of tabs and a whole bunch of values. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them. Honestly, experiment with this because all of these are just random sliders that can do different things. You can adjust the vibrancy of your image, the saturation of it. You can adjust the temperature. With the Camera Raw Filter, what I found out is that colors really tell a story. And what I like to do is really play around with the colors here. So I like to kind of adjust this area as well as the split toning tab, which allows you to kind of add duotones into your image. With Camera Raw Filter, because there are so many tabs for you to adjust, sometimes it's a good thing to kind of create one that by default you like to go back to again and again. So for me personally, I have done so. So I like to go to this settings option here and then click load settings. And I'm just going to navigate down my crazy folder system and open photo book settings, which is a setting that I kind of use very often. This particular setting, I just adjusted the white balance and the vibrancy. And then I've done a bit of sharpening to it and also added a little bit of grain and a bit of vignetting. And of course, I did a bit of split toning. So even though I have a save setting, I still do a lot of adjustments. So you can kind of treat the save setting as a starting point, and then I do a lot of tweaking from there as well. How the image looks like with all the adjustments from Camera Raw Filter. When I flip back to the original, you can tell how dramatically changed the entire shot is and how much more of a mood it kind of takes on. At this point, we can pretty much wrap up the entire walkthrough. All that's left is just cropping your image to whatever resolution you guys want to. I'm going to kind of leave mine the way it is because I kind of want to use different resolutions for this particular image. I just wanted to say thank you so much for sticking through the entire walkthrough, and I know that these couple of videos were a little bit long. I just wanted to kind of condense everything I know, and I wanted to teach you as much as possible so that I can pat myself on the back and say that I finally did this tutorial. So with that in mind, what my walkthrough is just a little puddle in the entire ocean called Secondlife Photography. There are honestly so many different types of photography styles and techniques available for you guys to learn, but I hope that this tutorial and walkthrough kind of gives you an insight to how I personally approach photography in Second Life. If you have any questions that you want me to answer, feel free to comment down below and I'll get back to it as soon as possible. Once more, thank you guys for sticking around, and I hope to see you in the next video.